apologize if this thing isn't in tune. I don't want to tune it with me. Hi guys, anybody know what I'm wearing?
Costume.
Okay, so I take it at least a few of you now have some kind of idea what mummers are. So, who better to provide you guys with a history and some background information than a long-time member in good standing of the original Trilby String Band, one of the oldest bands on the street. Now, the freedictionary.com defines a mummer as a costumed or masked merrymaker, usually at a festival, who performs in folk play or mime. We kind of lost the mime bit, but makes a lot of sense. Now, I assume most of you guys are locals. Live in the Philly area? Well, I figure New Year's is coming up. Might as well give you a little bit of background on one of the most unique Philadelphia traditions that's still alive today. It's really weird, and a lot of people I talk to just don't get it. Sometimes I really don't get it either, but it's a lot of fun, it's a great party, and it's something really special about our city. So, I will be giving you guys a brief overview of a long-time Philadelphia tradition, how it began, what it has become, and some of the rough patches that have been faced along the way. One might start by asking, what are mummers and where did they come from? Well, the roots go back a lot further than you might think. It traces back to ancient pagan festivals, all the way up to the first Philadelphia settlers, and then we came to the early parade, back in the very early 1900s. It started out in ancient Greece and Rome. Costumes were used, so was music, in festivals to celebrate the gods. And then as time moved on in the Middle Ages, these traditions moved north into England, France, and Germany. And these pagan rituals, like the holiday of Saturnalia, which is the midpoint through winter, used these costumes and music to celebrate everything that they stood for, how far they had gotten. And a lot of it was also transferred into early Christian mythology with Easter and Christmas plays. Now, a lot of the early Philadelphia settlers were from Sweden, and they brought their traditions with them from the old world coming into America, of ringing in the new year by visiting friends and family, going from house to house in the days right after Christmas. They would celebrate with masquerades and parties. And in the early 1600s, it wasn't uncommon for people to walk around armed. So a lot of times you would hear gunfire along with the music to ring in the new year. Now, these men became known as the New Year's shooters. And this name is still used today in one of the biggest mass associations in charge of a lot of the policies and rules of mummery, known as the New Year's Shooters and Mummers Association, but I'll get to that in a little bit. In 1901, the first parade was held, and my band actually was established in 1898. So we're older than the parade, and we were one of the 3 bands that actually marched in that parade along with a number of comic troops. We're the only group from that first parade that is still in existence today, and we're rather proud of that legacy. I completely lost my place. Over many years, Mummers Parade went from being an informal celebration to the massive financial and popular undertaking that it is today. It's a really popular annual event, and it brings us to today's parades. Now, today there are associations that run this whole thing. There's the New Year's Shooters and Mummers, who are on the broad spectrum, overlooking everything, and then we get into the individual of the 4 divisions, such as the string bands, with the String Band Association, who tells us what we need to do, how many people we need to have, and all the other rules for competing, down to your individual clubs and their presidents and officers. Within the 4 divisions, we have the comics, the fancies, the fancy brigades, and the string bands. The comics are the oldest and most notorious of mummer troops, because they're the ones that you will see on YouTube in drunken fights on New Year's night. They are usually They usually perform some kind of political or social satire with their theme. There isn't a lot of organization to it. It's really just like they show up at their clubs on New Year's Day, pay their fee, get their costumes, and strut up Broad Street. There are two kinds of comic brigades. There are the comic clubs and the wench brigades, which are the same thing as the comic clubs, except they usually dress in drag, which involves skirts, bloomers. They're all clowns. It's a long-standing tradition of like sexism and patriarchy, but it's been allowed to stand for the last 100 years, and they're not doing much to change it now. Then we've got the fancies. There are 4 mother clubs for the fancies, and these are the guys with the really ornate costumes. They have really small floats, small backdrops, all of the emphasis is on their costumes, and they perform complicated dance routines as they march up Broad Street. Then there are the fancy brigades. These are the guys with the massive 10-foot back pieces made of sequins and feathers and lamé and anything you can think of. And the fancy brigades have actually been moved off the street, and they now have their show in the Philadelphia Convention Center, because in the 1970s, these props and back pieces got so massive that they were being blown up the street by the wind. So they couldn't perform outside anymore. But these are some of the most ridiculous costumes I have ever seen. And then finally we've got my division, the string bands, which is a lot of people's favorite, and it's also considered one of the most complicated forms, because we're in these huge ridiculous costumes, playing our own instruments. We're the only ones that play while performing these really complicated dance routines. So it gets really complicated, it gets really fun, but it's something we love to do and we always do. So those are the 4 types of mummers. There are currently 17 association string bands. There used to be a number of non-association string bands, but most of them have folded due to financial issues, members leaving, those kind of things. There are varying degrees of difficulty within mummery, but it all comes together to result in one spectacular parade. Although mummery has evolved a lot since its beginning, it hasn't been without its stumbling blocks. There have been issues faced, but the associations usually rise up and meet it with flying colors. There's always been a problem with racism in the mummers. You will not find too many African American mummers. There's nothing against it, they just really aren't common. Back from the early days of the parade up until about the 60s, blackface was in common use in the parades. In the 1960s, according to a dissertation that I found called Strutting It Up Through the Histories, in the 1960s, city officials banned the use of blackface at the request of civil rights activists. And then in the 1970s, there were, this is when women actually became involved in the parades. Now beforehand, it had always been a family affair, but it was always the men who did the performing, and the women would make these ridiculous costumes, and then they would have food and drink waiting for the men when they finished a parade or a rehearsal. So in the 1970s, which is actually Jolene was nice enough to give me this, this is a program from Mummer's Show of Shows 1975, which is our big show in Atlantic City every year. This is when women actually started becoming involved in the parades themselves. And a friend of mine's mother was one of the first women who went up the street with Hageman String Band. It took a long time. A lot of bands are still men only, but it's very common to have female captains, female dancers, and female players in the bands nowadays. So women have come a long way. And then there's also been this reach forward into technology and modernizing our routines. Is that on? No? Oh. A lot of bands have updated their repertoires with, as well as our old-timey mum tunes, like I'm Looking Over a Four-Leaf Clover. We also play songs like, CeeLo Green's Forget You, Michael Jackson's Thriller. And I wanted to show you guys this, if it'll come up. This was the South Philly Vikings String Band. First place South Philly Vikings Fancy Brigade, and this was their first place performance last year because they had these ridiculous LED color-changing light-up suits. So there have been a lot of movement forward, and a lot has changed since those early parades. There we go. These suits are actually on display in the Mummers Museum because they are so ridiculous.
So cool.
And I believe these suits cost upwards of $5,000 each. But anyway, Mummers have really come into their own in the new millennia. And from our early roots in ancient Greece to the first settlers to the 4 different divisions, everything today is a combination of our tradition, our roots, and looking forward to the future. So as long as the spirit remains in this indomitable city, hopefully so will this amazingly unique tradition.